My teenage son said he was at basketball practice. He's been selling weed to classmates. Before we dive into this absolutely shocking story that will make every parent question whether they really know what their teenager is doing after school, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up right now. This is the kind of story that every parent needs to hear because it shows how easily our children can use something as innocent as sports practice to cover up activities that could destroy their future and put them in serious legal trouble. Trust me, what I discovered about my 16-year-old son's after-school activities was so unexpected and terrifying that it made me realize I had been completely blind to what was happening right under my nose. They say that keeping teenagers busy with sports and extracurricular activities is one of the best ways to keep them out of trouble and on the right path. As parents, we encourage our kids to join teams, participate in activities, and build healthy habits that will serve them well in life. We trust that when our children tell us they're at practice or team events, they're in a safe, supervised environment where they're learning valuable lessons about teamwork and responsibility. But what happens when that trust is being exploited to cover up illegal activities? What happens when your teenager isn't just skipping practice, but is using practice time to engage in drug dealing that could ruin their life forever? My name is David, and until 6 weeks ago, I thought my 16-year-old son Jake was a dedicated basketball player who spent most afternoons at practice or team events. I thought his commitment to the sport was teaching him discipline and keeping him focused on his goals for high school and college. I had no idea that when Jake told me he was going to basketball practice, he was actually using that time to sell marijuana to his classmates, turning what I thought was a healthy activity into a cover for criminal behavior that could have destroyed his future. I'm 42 years old, a high school principal in Denver, Colorado, and I've been married to my wife Lisa for 18 years. We have 2 children, Jake, who's 16 and a junior in high school, and his younger sister Emma, who's 13 and in 8th grade. As an educator, I've always been deeply involved in my children's academic and extracurricular activities, and I thought I had a good understanding of their daily routines and social activities. Jake had been playing basketball since middle school and was on the varsity team at his high school. He was a decent player, not a star, but skilled enough to earn playing time and contribute to the team. Basketball seemed to be a positive influence in Jake's life, giving him structure, physical exercise, and a sense of belonging with his teammates. Jake's coach, Mr. Henderson, was a respected teacher at the school who emphasized academic performance as well as athletic achievement. The team had a good reputation, and I was proud that Jake was part of a program that stressed character development and responsibility. Basketball practice is from 3:30 to 5:30 every weekday. Jake would tell me at the beginning of each season. Sometimes we have extra practices on Saturdays if we have a big game coming up. I appreciated Jake's dedication to the team and was happy to support his athletic interests by providing transportation, equipment, and encouragement for his basketball goals. Over the past year, I had noticed that Jake seemed to have more spending money than his modest allowance and part-time job at a local grocery store should have provided. He would buy expensive sneakers, gaming equipment, and clothes without asking for financial help from Lisa and me. I've been getting more hours at work, Jake would explain when I asked about his increased spending. Plus, some of the older guys on the team have been paying me to help them with their homework. Jake's explanations seemed reasonable, and I was proud that he was showing initiative and earning money through hard work and tutoring. I also noticed that Jake's academic performance had declined slightly over the past few months. His grades were still decent, but not as strong as they had been in previous years. Basketball season is really demanding, Jake said when I asked about his grades. Between practice, games, and travel, it's hard to keep up with all my homework. As an educator, I understood the challenges that student athletes face in balancing sports and academics, so I didn't immediately see Jake's grade decline as a serious problem. The first red flag came when I tried to attend one of Jake's basketball practices to watch him play and show my support for the team. I arrived at the school gymnasium around 4 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, expecting to see the team running drills and practicing plays. But when I entered the gym, I found only a few players and a substitute coach running a light practice session. "Is Jake Patterson here?" I asked the substitute coach. "Jake hasn't been to practice in over a week," the coach replied. Coach Henderson has been trying to reach him about his absences. I was shocked and confused. Jake had left for school that morning and told me he would be at basketball practice until 5:30 p.m. If he wasn't at practice, where was he? When Jake came home that evening at his usual time, I confronted him about what I had learned at the gymnasium. "Jake," I said, "I went to your practice today, and the coach said you haven't been there in over a week. Where have you been going after school?" Jake looked panicked for a moment before attempting to explain. "Coach Henderson has been giving some of us individual training sessions at different times," he said. "I've been working on on my shooting at the outdoor courts behind the school. When I asked Jake why Coach Henderson hadn't mentioned these individual sessions when I spoke with the substitute coach, Jake became defensive and accused me of not trusting him. "Why are you checking up on me like this?" he asked angrily. "I'm 16 years old, and I should be able to manage my own practice schedule." Jake's defensive reaction made me more suspicious rather than reassured, and I decided to investigate further. The second red flag came when I contacted Coach Henderson directly to ask about Jake's participation in basketball and his academic standing with the team. "Mr. Patterson," Coach Henderson said when I called him, "I'm glad you reached out. Jake has been missing practices regularly for the past month, and I've been concerned about his commitment to the team." Coach Henderson explained that Jake's absences had been affecting his playing time and his standing with the team. "I've left several messages asking Jake to call me to discuss his attendance," Coach said, "but he hasn't responded to any of my calls." This conversation confirmed that Jake had been lying to me about his basketball activities and that there were no individual training sessions or alternative practice arrangements. The third red flag came when I noticed changes in Jake's behavior and social circle that suggested he was involved in activities that had nothing to do with basketball. Jake started receiving more phone calls and text messages, often at unusual hours. When I asked who was contacting him so frequently, Jake would claim they were teammates discussing practice schedules or game strategies. "That's just Marcus asking about tomorrow's practice time," Jake would say when his phone buzzed during dinner. But Jake's phone activity seemed excessive for normal team communication, and he was protective about his phone in ways that seemed unusual. Jake also started spending time with people I didn't recognize, older teenagers and some young adults who would pick him up from our house or meet him at nearby locations. "Those are friends from other schools," Jake explained when I asked about his new social contacts. "I met them at basketball tournaments and pickup games. But these friends didn't seem to have any connection to basketball or athletics, and they didn't look like the type of people Jake would typically associate with." The fourth and most concerning change was in Jake's attitude toward authority and his future plans. Jake became increasingly dismissive of school rules, family expectations, and long-term goals like college preparation. He seemed to have developed a casual attitude toward money and seemed less motivated by traditional rewards and consequences. "School is boring," Jake would say when I encouraged him to focus on his grades. "I can make more money doing other things than I'll ever make with a college degree." Jake's attitude suggested that he was involved in activities that provided immediate financial rewards but were disconnected from legitimate career preparation or education. The situation came to a head 4 weeks ago when I received a phone call at work that changed everything. "Mr. Patterson," the caller said, "this is Detective Maria Santos with the Denver Police Department. We need to talk to you about your son Jake's activities." My blood ran cold. As a high school principal, I knew that calls from police detectives usually involved serious legal issues. Detective Santos explained that Jake was being investigated as part of a larger operation targeting drug distribution in local high schools. "We have evidence that Jake has been selling marijuana to students at several schools in the district," Detective Santos said. "We'd like to speak with you before we interview Jake." I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My son, who I thought was a dedicated athlete focused on basketball, was apparently a drug dealer operating in the very school system where I worked as an administrator. Detective Santos arranged to meet with me that afternoon to discuss the investigation and Jake's involvement in drug sales. "Your son has been identified by multiple witnesses as someone who sells marijuana to high school students," Detective Santos explained when we met. "We've been tracking his activities for several weeks." The detective showed me evidence that included text messages, witness statements, and surveillance photos that clearly showed Jake engaging in drug transactions with other teenagers. "Jake appears to be getting his supply from older dealers and then selling smaller quantities to high school students," Detective Santos said. "He's been using basketball practice as his cover story while conducting these transactions." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Jake had been using the time I thought he was spending at basketball practice to sell drugs to his classmates and students from other schools. Detective Santos explained that Jake was facing serious criminal charges that could include felony drug distribution, depending on the quantities involved and his role in the larger operation. "As a minor, Jake will be processed through the juvenile justice system," she said, "but these charges could still have serious consequences for his future, including college admissions and career opportunities." I drove home that afternoon in a state of shock, trying to understand how my son had become involved in drug dealing without my knowledge and how I had failed to recognize the signs of his criminal activity. When Jake came home at his usual time, claiming to have been at basketball practice, I was waiting for him with Detective Santos. "Jake," I said, "Detective Santos needs to speak with you about your activities after school." Jake immediately knew that his lies had been discovered, and his face showed panic and fear rather than confusion or surprise. Detective Santos questioned Jake about his drug-dealing activities, and Jake eventually admitted to selling marijuana to classmates for several months. "I started small," Jake confessed, "just selling to a few friends who asked me to get them weed. But then I realized how much money I could make, and it became a regular thing." Jake explained that he had been getting marijuana from an older dealer who recruited him to sell to high school students because he had access to multiple schools and a good reputation that wouldn't immediately raise suspicion. "The guy said I was perfect for this because I was a good student and athlete, so people wouldn't suspect me of dealing drugs," Jake said. Jake had been deliberately exploiting his positive reputation and his parents' trust to operate a drug-dealing business while we believed he was pursuing healthy activities like basketball. The most devastating part of Jake's confession was learning how extensively he had been lying to us and how calculated his deception had been. Jake admitted that he had been skipping basketball practice regularly for months, using practice time to meet with clients and conduct drug transactions. He had been using his phone to coordinate sales and had developed a network of customers across multiple high schools in our district. Jake had also been recruiting other students to help him distribute drugs, essentially expanding his operation and putting more teenagers at risk of criminal charges. "I told some of my friends they could make easy money by helping me sell to people they knew," Jake said. "My son hadn't just been selling drugs, he had been actively recruiting other minors into criminal activity." If you're feeling as shocked and devastated as I was when I learned about Jake's drug-dealing operation, you need to hit that subscribe button right now because this story gets even more complicated when I found out how this affected my career as a school administrator and what I had to do to protect other families from my son's influence. What I discovered about the extent of Jake's operation and how it connected to larger drug networks will make you realize that teenage drug dealers aren't just experimenting, they're often part of serious criminal organizations. Ring that notification bell because you won't believe how this situation affected our entire family and community. Over the next several days, the full scope of Jake's drug-dealing operation became clear as Detective Santos continued her investigation. Jake had been selling marijuana to students at not just his own high school, but at 3 other schools in our district, including the middle school where his sister Emma was enrolled. Jake was using his connections through basketball games and tournaments to expand his customer base, Detective Santos explained. He would meet students from other schools and arrange to sell to them later. The investigation revealed that Jake had been making substantial amounts of money from his drug sales, far more than I had realized based on his spending patterns. Jake was earning between $800 and $1,200 per week from drug sales, Detective Santos said. He was hiding most of the money and only spending small amounts to avoid suspicion. Jake had been saving most of his drug money and had accumulated several $1,000s that he kept hidden in our house. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was learning that Jake was not working independently, but was part of a larger drug distribution network that specifically targeted high school students. Jake was recruited by adult dealers who use teenagers to sell drugs in schools because minors face less severe legal consequences than adults, Detective Santos explained. Jake had been manipulated by older criminals who exploited his desire for money and independence to involve him in serious criminal activity. As the investigation progressed, I had to face the professional consequences of my son's criminal behavior. As a high school principal, I was required to report Jake's drug dealing to my superintendent and the school board, since his activities involved students in our district. "David," my superintendent said when I informed him of the situation, "this puts us in a very difficult position. We need to consider how Jake's actions affect your ability to effectively perform your duties as a principal." I was placed on administrative leave while the school board determined how to handle the conflict of interest created by my son's criminal involvement with students in our district. The situation became even more complicated when parents of students who had been sold drugs by Jake began demanding that I be removed from my position as principal. "How can we trust a principal who couldn't even control his own son's drug dealing?" one parent asked during a school board meeting. I understood their concerns, but I also felt that I was being punished for Jake's choices rather than my own actions as an educator. Jake's arrest and the publicity surrounding his drug dealing also had severe consequences for our family's reputation in the community. Emma faced harassment and social isolation at her middle school because of her brother's criminal activity. Kids at school are saying that our whole family are drug dealers, Emma told me through tears. I don't want to go to school anymore. Lisa and I struggled to support Emma while also dealing with Jake's legal issues and the stress of my career being threatened by his actions. Jake was ultimately charged with felony drug distribution and possession with intent to distribute. As a minor, he was processed through the juvenile justice system, but the charges were serious enough to have long-term consequences for his future. Jake's criminal record will affect his ability to get into college, obtain financial aid, and pursue certain career paths, our lawyer explained. Jake's drug dealing had not only put him at immediate legal risk, but had also compromised his future opportunities and goals. The legal proceedings revealed additional details about Jake's involvement in drug sales that made the situation even more serious. Jake had been carrying significant quantities of marijuana and had been selling to students as young as 13 years old, including some students at Emma's middle school. Jake was specifically targeting younger students because they were less likely to have connections to buy drugs independently, the prosecutor explained. My son had been deliberately involving children in drug use and criminal activity, causing harm that extended far beyond his immediate customer base. Jake was sentenced to 2 years of juvenile probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory drug counseling, and regular drug testing. He was also expelled from his high school and required to complete his education through an alternative program for students with behavioral problems. Jake's basketball career was over, and his dreams of playing college sports were permanently destroyed by his criminal convictions. The investigation also led to the arrest of the adult dealers who had been supplying Jake with marijuana and recruiting him to sell drugs in schools. Jake's cooperation with our investigation helped us identify and arrest several adults who were using minors to distribute drugs, Detective Santos told me. While Jake's cooperation was helpful to law enforcement, it also put him at potential risk of retaliation from the criminal network he had been involved with. 6 months later, our family is still dealing with the consequences of Jake's drug dealing operation. I was ultimately allowed to return to my position as principal, but only after undergoing additional training and agreeing to enhanced oversight of my administrative duties. Many parents and community members still question my effectiveness as an educator because of my failure to recognize my son's criminal behavior. Jake is slowly rebuilding his life through his probation program and alternative education, but he struggles with the long-term consequences of his choices. I thought dealing drugs would give me independence and money, Jake told me recently, but it actually took away all my real opportunities and hurt everyone I care about. Jake has had to accept that his criminal record will affect his college options, career choices, and social relationships for years to come. Emma has gradually recovered from the social consequences of her brother's actions, but the experience taught her harsh lessons about how family members' choices can affect everyone. Lisa and I have learned painful lessons about the importance of maintaining closer supervision of our teenagers and recognizing warning signs of risky behavior. We now realize that Jake's increased spending, secretive phone activity, and changing social circle were clear indicators that he was involved in inappropriate activities. We also learned that trusting teenagers to self-report their activities and whereabouts requires verification and active parental involvement rather than passive acceptance of their explanations. The experience taught us that even good students and athletes can become involved in serious criminal activity if they're recruited by the wrong influences and if parents aren't paying close enough attention to their daily activities. Sometimes people ask me if I blame myself for Jake's involvement in drug dealing and whether I should have recognized the signs of his criminal behavior earlier. The answer is that I do bear some responsibility for not being more vigilant about Jake's activities and for accepting his explanations about basketball practice without verification. As both a parent and an educator, I should have been more aware of the warning signs of teenage drug involvement and more active in monitoring Jake's daily routine. But I also recognize that Jake made deliberate choices to become involved in criminal activity and to systematically lie to his family about his actions. Jake was old enough to understand that drug dealing was illegal and harmful, and he chose to pursue these activities despite the risks to himself and others. The adults who recruited Jake into drug dealing bear primary responsibility for exploiting a minor and involving him in criminal activity. Jake's story could have had much worse consequences if he had been caught with larger quantities of drugs, if he had been involved in violent crimes related to drug dealing, or if he had been tried as an adult rather than through the juvenile system. The early intervention by law enforcement likely prevented Jake from becoming more deeply involved in criminal activity and potentially saved him from more severe legal consequences. Our family's experience has made us advocates for better education about the realities of teenage drug involvement and the importance of active parental supervision during adolescence. We now work with other families and schools to help parents recognize warning signs of risky behavior and maintain appropriate oversight of their teenagers' activities. Jake's drug dealing operation was a wake-up call that reminded us that criminal activity can affect any family and that even trusted activities like sports can be exploited to cover up dangerous behavior. The experience strengthened our family's commitment to honesty, communication, and shared responsibility for making good choices that protect everyone's safety and future opportunities.